Since April 2017, more than 200 high-profile people have been accused of sexual misconduct.
These people range from celebrities to politicians to CEOs to athletes and others. Some of these people we have never heard of, others we are quite familiar with.
This wave of sexual misconduct accusations and cases has swept the nation. This is the Me Too movement, an international movement combating sexual harassment and assault. One of the problems with due process with regard to the Me Too movement is the credibility of victims. In most cases, to convict one accused of sexual misconduct, there must be either undeniable evidence or numerous other victims that can corroborate.
Things are tipped in favor of the accused until there is seemingly insurmountable evidence. So, should the Me Too movement ignore due process and statutes of limitations? First, we need to address what exactly due process and statutes of limitations are and how they apply to the Me Too movement.
Due process is the fair treatment through the judicial system and the requirement that a person's legal rights be respected.
A statute of limitations is a period of time during which certain kinds of legal action can be taken. Lawsuits, for example, cannot be filed against someone or something once the statute of limitations has passed.
The statutes of limitations for sexual assault are complicated and vary depending on the state and type of crime. Some of them also have exceptions.
To give just a sense of how varied these statutes of limitations are, in the state of Delaware, there is no statute of limitations for any sexual offense. In Nevada, the statute of limitations for sexual assault is 4 years. In West Virginia, misdemeanor sex offenses have only a 1-year statute of limitations.
As with any sensitive issue, it's important to look at both sides of the argument. Some feel that the Me Too movement should still be subject to due process and statutes of limitation. Some go as far as saying that the movement is more of a witch hunt than anything. An article in The Establishment, an online magazine funded and run by women that addresses social issues, explains one of the critiques of the movement. Some feel that due process, something the American legal system prides itself on, is overstepped. Rather than going through the courts, accusers go straight to the court of public opinion.
Critics feel that these claims should be filed through courts rather than on social media, so that basic fairness is guaranteed to the accused. Other critics bring up the issue of false reporting. One case that shows why sexual assault cases should be subject to due process is that of Brian Banks. In 2002, 17-year-old Brian Banks was accused of raping a former classmate. He spent 5 years in prison before his accuser admitted to having fabricated the whole story in 2012.
There had been no DNA evidence, and the claim was based solely on the victim's testimony. Ignoring due process would allow more false claims to put innocent people in prison.
Even in cases where there is DNA evidence available to courts, who is to say whether or not the sexual relations were consensual?
Cases involving alleged sexual assault are gray areas in the justice system. Such proceedings can end up being he said, she said due to difficulty in procuring physical evidence and relying solely on witness testimony.
There's also a problem with evidence.
Sexual harassment allegations usually lack physical evidence.
But now let's take a look at the argument of those who feel that the Me Too movement should indeed overstep due process and statutes of limitation. Sexual assault is an incredibly traumatic event that can take months or years to process. The trauma can make coming forward with allegations difficult. And this is why the statute of limitations are not long enough, if not completely irrelevant.
It can take years for a victim to process what happened, or even to come forward. Rape victims are also discouraged to come forward by the low chances of winning a case, let alone going to trial.
As mentioned earlier, the statute of limitations for sexual assault in Nevada is 4 years. What happens to victims who need longer time to deal with the trauma of sexual assault?
By the time they are ready to speak out against the action, their time may have passed. No justice is served here.
Furthermore, sexual assault can affect a victim for life, and a statute of limitations shouldn't be allowed to diminish the effect that the crime has on people's lives.
Clearly, sexual assault is a violent crime, but other violent crimes carry no statute of limitation whatsoever. For example, murder carries no statute of limitation in many states.
Both crimes affect numerous people for a lifetime, yet are treated very differently in court. From depression and PTSD to eating disorders, victims of sexual assault may struggle for years to cope with what happened to them.
To see what the public thinks of these issues, we interviewed New Rochelle High School students and faculty members.
The Me Too movement also incurs some economic effects. Researchers from Cornell University shows that the exposure to sexual harassment and assault can lead to excessive health hazards, including PTSD, depression, amplification of pre-existing mental health problems, and even long-term problems such as sleep disorders and heart disease.
This, of course, lowers worker productivity, results in higher turnover, and damages company reputations. Companies also spend large amounts of money on training and on legal settlements and lawsuits.
In 1994, sexual harassment cost the federal government $327 million, 88% of that coming from diminished productivity. The Me Too movement has generated some controversy.
The lack of physical evidence, tales of false reporting, and the potential to turn into he said, she said cases are arguments used to defend the belief that the Me Too movement should not overstep due process and statutes of limitation.
However, sexual trauma typically takes a long time to process and be able to speak about.
Murder has no statute of limitations.
Sexual assault can affect a victim for life. A statute of limitations shouldn't be allowed to diminish the effect that the crime has on people's lives. These are arguments used to defend the idea that the movement can ignore due process and statutes of limitation.
Maybe the justice system needs reform to reduce the startling sexual assault statistics, but how this change will be brought about is still up for discussion.